Mhm. Hello and welcome to the Parrish's fourth Friday Nights Live. We're delighted you're here. It's getting to be quite a thing. And we really miss you and look forward to the time we'll be together and be in person, but happy we can still meet on Fridays at 5. We want to give our thanks and deep appreciation to our very, very generous sponsors, Bank of America, and our presenting sponsor, they are, and in addition, the Corcoran Group and Stephen and Sandy Pearlbinder. Now, while I'm talking, please feel free to pose a question. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A there. Question, anything you'd like to ask or share. There's also a chat, which is a place for you to write a comment or just share about something. So at the end of the talk, I'm going to have all those are going to magically come up on the screen, and I'd like to respond to as many as we can in the time we have. Something very interesting last week when the chats came up, someone asked if we could ever do a talk on Fairfield Porter. Well, I thought that was a wonderful idea. Thank you very much. So that's what I'm going to talk about this week. Fairfield Porter, an artist who had a long and rich association with the East End of Long Island, specifically Southampton, and also with the Parrish Art Museum. So it gives me a real thrill to be able to speak about Porter tonight. So I think we'll start the slides. So I thought we'd open with these two self-portraits. On the left, Porter in his studio that was in New York. At that time, he had a New York studio, rather immobile, facing forward, half his face in shadow, a sort of strained portrait, you might say. We can't see any of the paintings in the background. And on the right, a painting some 38 years later of Fairfield Porter in his studio in Southampton. I think the interesting thing about this, and I just wanted to share a remark that John Ashbery noted in some of his essays on Porter, when he said a common topic of conversation among Fairfield Porter's poet friends was that his youthful appearance never changed. And he quotes one of the friends, although he doesn't attribute it. He says, I saw Fairfield today and he was looking 5 years younger than he was the last time I saw him 6 months ago. It's disgusting. I have an idea which of his poet friends that might be. But it was true about Porter that he never seemed to age. Many of his painter poet friends were younger than he. He might have gotten what you say a bit of a late start at being a painter. He didn't have his first show really until 1944. But let's go on and look at the next slide. Thank you. This is the Southampton studio. He and his wife Anne and their children moved out to Southampton in 1949. He often said that he'd like to live by the ocean if he couldn't get to Maine for the summer. His family had a house in Maine that they, on an island in Great Spruce Head in Penobscot Bay, where he had gone ever since childhood with his siblings. It meant a great deal to him. And he often thought if he couldn't get there in the summers, he'd still like to be near the ocean. They selected Southampton long before it was the Hamptons, or an artistic mecca, so to speak. They bought an old captain's house on South Main Street, 49 South Main, raised the family here. And there was a stable in back that Porter quickly converted to a studio for himself. This is the hayloft, of course, the second floor. And he put in the north skylight and the window, of course, the window, which wasn't plate glass. I guess that might have been prohibitively expensive or not safe in the old structure there. But the window had mullions, which he sometimes painted in and sometimes didn't. Interesting moment. You'll see there, upper left, his wife Anne, who was a wonderful model. She was often asked to pose for his work. These are two portraits he did, a self-portrait on the left, of course, from 1972, and a portrait of Anne on the right. She was an extraordinary poet in her own right, published later in her life, but not during this period, really. She wrote privately, you might say. She sometimes showed her work to her poet friends, but it wasn't until later in life that she was actually really sought after by them to publish her work. They felt so strongly about it. This is a painting in our collection done by John McQuinney, another one of the young painters who very much gravitated to Porter's circle. On the left is the photograph he took in 74 of the studio. It's interesting to see that intimate view, and then also to see John's painting as well. So this is this group I've been speaking about, this group of extraordinary young men, poets, excuse me, and they did paint, so don't let me sell them short, but best known as painters. Upper left is a portrait that Fairfield did of James Schuyler and John Ashbery. On the right, Frank O'Hara, in 1957, another of this, they came to be known as the New York School of Poetry. And at the bottom is Jane Freilicher's wonderful portrait of Kenneth Koch there with the beautiful hydrangea. Now, this was the crowd that probably said, might have been Schuyler who said, Fairfield just gets younger looking all the time. These were a group of poets so radically different from things that were being written in mid-century America. They really stand alone. They look back to Mallarmé and the French poets, and no wonder Fairfield fell in with this group. There's also a very funny story that I'll just digress for a moment, that Jimmy Schuyler tells. He told, and this is taken from a poet, when I told Alex Katz I went to college in West Virginia, he said in that way of his, he said, nah, you're Harvard. Wish I were, but I'm a lot more Panhandle than I am Cambridge, Mass. Schuyler was the only one who didn't go to Harvard, including Fairfield Porter, and that was another connection that they all had. Now on to these two extraordinary painters who were very close to Fairfield Porter. Younger painters who were working in a figurative manner became really attracted to Porter and his work because he was painting in that way, and that was certainly the time of when abstract expressionists were on the rise. Pollock and Crasner were, of course, already in East Hampton in Springs by the time Porter moved to Southampton. He didn't see too much of them, and around him was formed this sort of Southampton group of painters. This is Jane Freilicher on the left and Jane Wilson on the right, and they first rented a house really to be sort of near Porter out here, near Porter and Anne. And this was the first rental in the summer of '57. They rented a house together with their husbands in Watermill, which is the next, where the Parrish is now, and the next village over. Jane Freilicher once said, I paint the way I do because I have no imagination. She was a very, very funny and witty person. And of course, that's a bit of an overstatement. She had plenty of imagination, but it's just the same as Porter. They really wanted to paint what they saw. Jane Wilson, of course, always said she painted her sensations. In other words, that what she felt about nature and about the atmosphere. Both eventually had their own homes here, raised families, and were here for the better part of every year until their deaths. Porter and Freilicher were particularly close, and he, in fact, wrote about her. A reviewer, as I said, most of the poets, Schuyler, O'Hara, and certainly John Ashbery, they were all art critics as well. They wrote about art. They wrote brilliantly about art. And Porter also became an art writer. He was friendly with Elaine de Kooning, Willem de Kooning's wife, who was working at Art News with Thomas Hess. And this was just something that they did, walked and talked and conversed about art all the time. He wrote a review of Jane Freilicher's show at Tibor Denage, the gallery, in 1951. And it's interesting to know what he wrote. He said, when she has to choose between the life of the painting and the rules of construction, she decides to let the rules go. This is a wonderful painting that she did in 1957, Gray Day on the South Fork. I think you can sort of see Porter's words come to life here in looking at that painting, and that's something you could also, just as easily, Porter could have written it about his own work. He's really saying something of himself when he writes that, and possibly in much of the criticism that he wrote. These are two paintings, one by Porter on the left and one by Alex Katz. It's the Alex Katz on the right, and the Porter is on the left. Actually, this is from, I think, the only summer that Alex Katz spent on the East End, and he subsequently, when he's been going to Maine for many, many years, an interesting review that Porter wrote of Katz's work. He said, I would call Katz a realist, and he put that term realist in quotation marks. It was a term he was not too fond of because he was often labeled a realist, and he really bristled at that. At any rate, he wrote of Katz a realist, meaning you recognize every detail in his paintings, and the whole too, though the whole takes precedence over the detail, and the detail may be only an area of color. I don't think you can overstate the fact that he could say that about his own painting, seen here as well. The Katz was a gift to the Parrish collection many years ago, actually, by Jane and her husband, Jane Freilicher, and her husband, Joe Hazen, who had exchanged works with Katz. So wonderful to have that. These are portraits that Porter did of these two young painters to whom he felt so close. On the left is the painting of Jane, her young daughter Elizabeth. That's from 1960. Can you read that there? I can't read the captions that well. And he really brought Jane out. This is at the side of the house that she and Joe Hazen built in Watermill, a wonderful little ranch house there that they lived in for many, many years. And there's Elizabeth, who's about to, I think, wonderful painter herself now. But I think Porter sort of captures this. Elizabeth was probably none too happy about standing out there in the sun for this portrait. And she has that wonderful sort of fidget there of a typical two or 3-year-old. I think Porter knew well, having pressed his own children repeatedly into posing for him. But I think it's so interesting that he's brought Jane right out into the sun and brought out a director's chair from the dining room, no doubt, and has really placed her in the beautiful, extraordinary landscape that she painted so well. And those are really almost her colors, not his in a way. There's a photograph there that you see him working. Jane Wilson's painting is, in fact, in that hayloft studio. Those are the hayloft doors on the right, which you could open and take care not to tumble out, I'm sure. But the light streamed into the studio, the daylight, and that would have been Eastern light. And he tried unsuccessfully to paint several portraits of Jane. He felt maybe this one done out in the country would have better success, and he certainly felt it did. That rather extraordinary blouse she wore. And you'll see again and again Porter's interest in pattern and color and that way, which really relates him to some of the French painters like Vuillard and Bonnard that he saw very early on in the 30s in exhibitions in Chicago. And he loves to paint. I often thought the two, the O'Hara portrait and Schuyler and Ashbery on that couch that was in the studio, I often thought, well, why wouldn't he just throw a sheet over the couch and he could not spend so much time painting the decorative pattern of the upholstery, but we shall see. He definitely had a method in the madness there, so to speak. I do love this portrait of Jane Wilson for that loose flip-flop that's just fallen off her foot. And her relaxed and wonderful pose. She did write about this, and she said that he, Porter was tall, and he came, apparently the easel was very close to where she was, and it was a very intimate moment, very intense, she said. This is interesting moment that I really didn't realize. The first show that Roy Lichtenstein ever had in New York in 1952, he was still teaching at the University of Ohio. He was a native New Yorker, but he was teaching in Ohio. And this was the first show he had. Porter reviewed it, one of the short reviews. And this is what Porter wrote. A young newcomer who teaches at the University of Ohio is showing a group of semi-abstract, humorous paintings that imply the diverse interests, his diverse interests from scholarship to folk art and folk humor, and the folk humor of a young intellectual. And on the right is his painting, I believe the VIP, which is sort of a self-portrait. Porter goes on, he spreads one flat color next to another and lets it alone. He's a natural. So I think it's very interesting how Porter in 1951, so this is almost Lichtenstein before he was Lichtenstein, the early work, but he sort of nails it when he talks about Roy's humor and his way of applying paint. Interestingly enough here, I'll just mention that there's a wonderful show being organized, will premiere this fall at the Nasher Museum on Lichtenstein's early work, pre-pop, obviously, works just like this painting, and will be shown there, go in the spring to Colby College Museum, and then wonderfully come to the Parrish, April 2021. So we all have that to look forward to. That'll be a real homecoming. You're probably wondering who this chap is. You know, I found it's amazing what's on the internet. I've heard about Jacques Marget, who was a painter and head of the technical laboratory at the Louvre for many, many years. Studied paint. Paint was his passion. And he immigrated to the US in 1939. He's probably best known for what's called the Marget method, which is a way of producing a medium. You can either use it as on the canvas to prime a canvas or to mix it with oils. Porter, as I said, had a sort of, I say a bumpy road in the first 15, 20, even 20 years that he was painting. He did study, he painted from life, he studied from other painters. He also copied paintings in the Met, Metropolitan Museum. He loved Tiepolo. He loved the pinks in the sky. He often said that he painted his studio, which was a beautiful pink, a wonderful color, in homage to Tiepolo, and also because it was the most flattering color in the whole world. In 1945, he took a course. He heard about Marget teaching at Parsons School of Design. Porter took a course there in 1945 and learned the, I don't know if you had to take the class to learn the secret to the Marget method, but he did. It's a combination of, and I'm a non-painter, full disclosure, so I have to read this, and I have it on the best authority here, so it should make sense to many of you here, but it used beeswax, white lead, and raw linseed oil, which you would boil until it was pitch black. and then, as I say, uses either primer or to be on, mixed in with oils in your color. Well, Porter loved it. He said it went on wet and it stayed that way. He loved that you could move the paint around in that way. And this wonderful painting on the right where you see the canister of white lead and the mineral spirits. This is, the tools of the trade. An interesting, certainly perspective on it, but looking down at his painting table, I think it's so interesting to know about this methodology. I guess it was viewed as something sort of old-fashioned at that point, but he was a student always of the old masters. Maraget's book was in fact titled, the book he wrote on his method, Secret Form and Techniques of the Masters. Well, as John Ashbery, who is probably the most astute observer of Porter's work, close friend, often wrote about him. What I think is so interesting, Porter actually, excuse me, he picked up on the fact that he wrote about, he said Porter preferred to paint air rather than space. And I love that. Ashbery, I think, really sort of got into the essence of what Porter brought to the canvas. And he says, and Ashbery goes on to say, and he gives us life-sustaining air in the sense of the immediacy of experience. I often think the beautiful backyard Southampton on the right, you've probably all seen it those mornings when you go out and the fog is just sort of lifting and you see it, the sun, the light coming up, but you still see these, big trees, which are almost enshrouded, non-visible, sort of come into clear sight. On the left, lawn scene, 1953, I will give a shout out to the venerable Mrs. Malcolm Littlejohn, who was the woman who really reopened and reinvigorated the parish in the 1950s. And aside from buying 19th century painters who lived out here, and we have a wonderful collection of Chase among other artists, but she didn't miss out on what was going in contemporary art as well. She purchased this Porter directly from Porter in 1953. Beautiful painting, lawn scene. I read something interesting that Porter said in an interview on Street with Old Trees. It's probably from the late 60s, early 70s. He said, November, after the leaves have fallen, may be the best time of year on Long Island. I like the way the trees don't block the light anymore. This is a small scale painting, but it's absolutely beautiful. On the left is Spring Fog. Very funny, he once sort of took on a writer who had written a piece about him, and she had submitted it to him, perhaps with some temerity, but he didn't hesitate to tell her what he thought. So he said, he complained about several sentences that she'd written, and one was that he particularly honed in on was that she had written, since he, Porter, does not like the white, misty summer light of the Hamptons, he goes to an island in Maine in the summer. Now this made Porter quite agitated, because he said, the fact is we go to Maine in the summer because I have done that since I was 6 years old. It is my home more than any place other, and I belong there. The white misty light would never be a reason for my doing anything. So I love, it's a great retort. I don't know if he wrote it to the essay, but I think he must have sent it back to her. And what's amazing about these, I think about the paintings, is that the way they have this vehemence, of abstraction, but they speak an altogether different language in a way. Speaking of the light, I wanted to include these two wonderful, this is what we say when we think of Vuillard and Bonnard and Porter, looking at those painters, early turn of the century French painters who love to depict these interiors and love to catch the play of the light, the wonderful globe on the light on the right, that's Lawrence typing and boy reading. On the left, obviously, two of the boys at home. And this wonderful play of that turquoise light that sort of shoots around the room. And of course, on the wall is a framed Audubon print, which moved with them. Every house they were ever in, every place they lived, had that Audubon print. But you see the reflection, and the reflection of the light as well. He was, of course, the interesting patterns of the light on the floor. So really a beautiful composition. And the sort of Ouija-esque wallpaper, which was in the living room in the Southampton house. Now, as I said, Pollock and Crasner were living in the Springs. They had moved out in 1947, and Porter, though he certainly knew of Pollock, certainly thought the work was important. He, as far as abstract expressionists, he was much more a compatriot and an admirer of de Kooning. They had, in fact, known each other in the 30s for a very long time in New York. As you know, de Kooning had been painting abstractly, and then after about 35 he sort of returned to the figure, certainly in the storied series he did, the Women series. These are wonderful, wonderful photographs taken by a photographer named Tony Vaccaro, who's well into his 90s now, living in New York. He was probably best known for work he did, came to prominence for Life and some of the journal magazines after the war, and took a lot of celebrity photographs. He came out to the East End on several occasions, loved to be with artists and go into their studios. This is, in fact, the first summer, it's 1953, that de Kooning came out to the East End. That's, of course, Elaine de Kooning, his extraordinary partner and wife. She was a wonderful artist, and also, I think I mentioned, an important art critic that had was originally the connection with Porter coming to Art News. At any rate, he'd been invited to the house of Leo Castelli, who was renting a house in Georgia, and inviting artists to come and stay. So he made a studio. Basically, Castelli made a studio space there on that corner of the house. And this is de Kooning working on the series, the Women's series, while he was there. In a 1959 review, Fairfield Porter wrote about de Kooning. Instead of feminine grace, de Kooning's women have the grace of the stroke of the brush at the end of his arm. So again, this idea of not, although figurative, although representational, whatever you want to call recognizable subject matter in paintings, it's not really about the figure or the landscape, or it is about the paint, both for de Kooning, whom Porter admired totally. And these are two paintings that one, the very early seated boy on the right, and the chair, which is always reminds me of Van Gogh's Room, and maybe on the right, the influence of some of the figurative work that de Kooning was doing at the same time. Two paintings from both, again, in the Porter's house. On the left is Lawrence playing chess, and on the right is a portrait of his three sons, actually, John, Richard, and Lawrence. It's interesting, and a wonderful curator did an exhibition for us on thinking about the Klaus Ottman did a show thinking about the Porter paintings that ostensibly might be unfinished, or works that he had not completed, or works that he perhaps wasn't happy with. I mean, they're unsigned. And certainly on the right, you see this idea of a painting, a drip coming down on the painting of the three sons. Actually, Porter himself said, apparently it was a discussion one night at the 8th Street, the club, at the studio that artists came to and had long discussions. And it came up, does one sign one's paintings on the front? Does one put it on the back? And a lot of sort of thinking about this. And Porter stood up and he said, you know, if an artist is vain and he signs his painting, it's vain. If a painter is not vain and he doesn't sign his paintings, it isn't not vain. He didn't think that really signing a painting, signing and dating it, although he did, sometimes on the front, sometimes he didn't, that was the criteria that was actually in play. If no one wants to sign, if one is, all right, this is tautology, I'm not gonna get into again. But the fact of the matter is a good number of his paintings were left unsigned. This painting particularly, and also the question of drips, which sometimes comes up. Certainly no one questioned Pollock's drips, but I guess the burden on the figurative painter is to not drip. He said once a dealer, Tibor Denage, had come back to him and said a painter, a customer, actually, a client who was interested in the painting, was somewhat disturbed by the drips. And Porter said to him, well, that's the way the painting is. And I think that's the reality of this painting and the three sons. It's interesting, a wonderful artist gave a talk on Porter at the gallery in the exhibition last summer that we had of Porter's work. And he talked about the paint, and interesting always, I think, to look at, I'm an art historian, so I always bring a good deal of, I don't want to call it baggage, but you know, a lot of history, a lot of things I've known and read. I bring a lot to that. Painters, I think, and the painters that I know well and have looked at art with, they are the ones who really look at the paint and look at what the artist is saying with the paint. Then this is the three sons. John is on the left, the eldest. Jerry in the center, who later was called Richard, and on the right is Lawrence. And this artist who was talking about the painting said it seemed to him that the young man on the left, he did not even know they were Porter's sons, but the young man on the left was more opaque and hard to reach. The boy in the center was also not present for the painter as much, and the young man on the right, whose face is sort of half in sight, was the one he was closest to. And this really is sort of the story of the three boys and their relationship with their father. So very interesting what the paint actually in this painting says about these relationships. Extraordinary. I mentioned Maine. These are the Porter siblings in Great Spruce Head. You may know Elliot Porter, who is a brother, a very important 20th century photographer. So the four boys and the sister there. And as he said, he grew up going there. It was a place very, very dear to his heart and for that of his family. And some of the best known paintings, of course, are from there as well. This is wonderful painting. This on the left is not in our collection, but I wanted to did want to show it to you. It's sort of this extraordinary way of bringing order out of disorder. Another brilliant phrase that Ashbery had about Porter was that order seems to come from searching for disorder. And we have to wonder, and awkwardness from searching for harmony or likeness or following a system. When you arrange, you fail. He said that's probably Porter's mantra, that if you really try to arrange something and neaten it up there, you certainly would not have left those chairs as they are displayed there. This is, of course, the great room in the house in Maine. It was the great gathering place for the family. There you see two of the daughters working, or nieces, and this dress pattern, that's the title of the piece, which seems to be the least of things in the painting that you notice. This sort of extraordinary geometric spacing of the chairs. But that is what Porter, what he's so incredible at showing us. On the right, another later piece, also the living room at Great Spruce Head. But I love that when you arrange, you fail. Sometimes it's really all about the beauty of the place. This is a painting that almost looks unfinished in some ways, because you can see some underdrawing about these islands. I would think that that maybe when it got to this point, it was he thought if he went any further, he might fail. It's a beautiful, beautiful composition. The foreground painting, of course, of the flowers and the distant water and sky. Complete. This is again the arrangements on the tabletops, and the two Lawrence on the left and Katie on the right. It's often said that he would never let anyone clear the dishes off the table, so it was a perpetual sort of cacophony of objects that never got cleaned up and taken care of. Jimmy Schuyler wrote something quite wonderful in a review. What we have in Porter's paintings, he said, is an aspect of everyday life, neither seen as a snapshot nor as an exaltation. Its art is one that values the everyday as the ultimate, the most varied and desirable knowledge. What these paintings celebrate is never treated as an archetype. They are concentrated instances. They are not a substitute for religion. They are an attitude toward life. Carrying on this theme of the snapshot, the intimacy, I love these paintings. There's a random high chair there outside the house. Don't forget that beautiful pink towel thrown over the edge there. And the pump house on the right from Maine, and the clothes on the line. I mean, this is in fact that sort of thought that everyday life is really the ultimate of what we want to see and preserve. I do believe this is, yes. I wanted to close with this portrait of Anne Porter. Absolutely a summative statement, not only of her and their relationship, but of his life as well. There's that great big window, as I pointed out, this time without the mullions, so it looks like just one large piece of glass. Tacked up on the wall are some images that Porter always kept around him. Lower left is a cover of Life magazine. It's of Adlai Stevenson, who was the rather intellectual Democratic candidate who went down in defeat in the 50s. Politics, Porter's politics were always left-leaning. He had a sort of period of socialism, being associated with New York socialism in the 30s. In the center there, you see one of the young princes of Velázquez. Porter adored European, many of the European old masters, particularly Velázquez, and he always kept one of his works sort of tacked up there to remind him. He also did many sketches himself of copies after Velázquez to sort of keep his hand in it. Then in the upper right, you see the small sort of cropped in cut head of the Mona Lisa in black and white, and probably cut out from a magazine, sort of, you know, then is now a sort of trope for bisexuality. Anne's dress is apparently one that she was, one of her favorite. Again, this extraordinary moment of setting this down on paint, and the amazing Quaker cape she brought as sort of a like a saint's iconic piece. As part of her, it was her mother's, and she very treasured it. She wanted to bring it into the painting. I wanted to just close with a brief poem that Anne Porter wrote that I think is so beautiful. It's called The Neighboring Sea. At 3 in the morning, the village is all in silence, but the silence is afloat on the roar of the sea, and all the streets are bathed in the roar of the sea. The waves are at their labors, cresting and flooding all along the shore, tumbling and spinning the kelp and the devil's apron, threshing to meal the morsels and crumbs of stone and the light seashells with their storm blue linings. This is the time of day when I remember that down at the end of the street there is an ocean, a nation of fishes and whales, a sky-colored country stretching from here to Spain, a liquid kingdom dragged about by the moon. Beautiful. It's a beautiful book, published Living Things, with her poetry. Any questions, comments? I hope you enjoyed it. It was a treat for me to look at Porter's work always and sort of bring in some of the words and from him and from his friends, and most especially from Anne Porter. Yeah. Oh, here you are. You can see how versed I am at this. The Q&A comes up. Oh, there it is, my goodness. Did you ever meet Fairfield? No, I did not. Sadly, he died in 1975. And I had not, although I was here then, I had not met him. I did know Anne and his daughter Elizabeth over the years. Elizabeth is still here, and was happy to have known them. Someone is asking, is there any movement currently in place to preserve or possibly move the Fairfield Porter studio in Southampton? The studio has fallen into significant disrepair and will not be standing much longer if something isn't done. I don't honestly know. I know it's been in private hands, certainly, for a long time after Anne Porter moved from the property. So I don't know. It's a 19th century building, so I don't, anything's possible, but I honestly don't know. Thank you. What was the turning point when Fairfield began to believe in himself? What a great question. Let me have a. I don't know. I did say that his first show was at the age of 44. It was at T-Board and Usher. It was actually Willem de Kooning who wanted him to, who urged Johnny Myers to do the exhibition. I don't know. I don't know that he ever felt totally satisfied. He did at one point make good income from the sale of paintings. Porter seems to me to be, a searcher. You might say he was really hitting his stride. Some of the gorgeous late paintings from '75. He went out to, I think, walk the dog one morning and just succumbed to a massive heart attack right there on Main Street. I think painters always have to believe in themselves from the very beginning. To some extent, it's something makes you, those of us who know our friends who, I always say they get up and eat their Wheaties and then they go and make art, which I consider truly, truly extraordinary. So there has to be a belief because he stuck with it. He stuck with it. And by the mid-70s and into the mid-70s, he was getting much, much more well-known. Of course, the first big retrospective of his work was a posthumous one at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Okay, good question. Terry, you think that Spring Fog is a finished painting? Well, I think it's I think we have to take his paintings at face value. The gift to the museum was basically the works that remained in the studio, the house and studio at his death. Now, not all artists destroy works that they don't want to be seen, but it's a practice that many artists do for just this reason. I think Spring Fog, I'll admit it was a painting I always had some reservations about. And then other people have found such beauty and completion in that, what you might call the incompletion of the painting. So I would say the jury is out, possibly, on that one. That's a great answer. Great question. Any more here? Oh, yes, look at this. Very nice. Thank you very much, Philip. My pleasure. Yes, someone is asking the extent of, there are over 200 works. Many of them are small sketches on board. And many of them are full-scale paintings, again, that he kept. We have exhibited them many, many times over the years. There are always paintings by Porter on view in different contexts. We have organized about 4 major traveling shows over the years. So I have to say that looking again in Porter, in the last few days when I was getting ready for this, I just thought, you know, sometimes you think it's just time again. These paintings are so wonderful, and there's such a good deal of interest because so many young painters are figurative painters or realist or what, however you want to characterize that. But, you know, abstraction is not the only name of the game. And of course, as Porter said, he felt whole passages in his work was abstract, or paintings were abstract. So I was, I think another full-scale retrospective would be a wonderful idea. Then we could see more and more Porter. Thank you. And hi. All these years, I not know that Elliot Porter and Fairfield Porter were brothers. Isn't that funny? And Schwatzky, wonderful photographer. I didn't know it, you know, at a point I found out, but I had never heard about them. Something interesting, Porter did a lot of paintings in Maine that one group of curators who, Bill Agee worked on the big show for us, and he found about 12 pictures that he called the trail paintings. They are literally pieces, paintings, small, done, you know, outside in Maine, looking directly down at the ground. Now, the interesting thing is that Elliot Porter has done that very same work, and I've never seen them together. That would be great. But yes, Elliot Porter is his brother. Stephen? As painters and social commentators, who were Porter's most important direct influences as painters and social commentators? Well, as a contemporary, he was extremely, I think, influenced by de Kooning, just by de Kooning's handling of paint and what that meant. That kind of like what's on the end of the brush that's at the end of your arm. De Kooning famously never painted a huge mural-sized paintings, or what you might call the Pollock-sized abstract expressionists. He never went sort of farther than his arms would extend. And that's sort of what Porter picked up on this idea of the paint at the end of the brush. You didn't want to, you know, sort of divorce that very daub of paint at the end of the brush from your body in a way. So I think that influenced Porter. A lot of things with de Kooning, whom he admired totally, and social commentators. Well, he certainly read Whitehead or social commentators. I'm trying to think. He was certainly well versed in philosophy, as anyone who went to Harvard in that period was, and knew a great deal about, very read in history. And I don't know so much about social commentators. I mean, his politics were always, I would say, left of center in that sense. Rashid here. Porter and de Kooning. Material Witness, which I enjoyed so much. Yes, there are some wonderful books on Porter. One, a compilation of letters, basically. It's called Material Witness. Very good. Thanks, Rashid. You missed the preview. Well, all of our Friday night talks are on the website. They will be posted at the end, about 10 days late. They will be posted, so you can go back and see anything that you've missed. What about Eric Fischel and April Gornick? Always a great topic. Wonderful, wonderful artists. Cindy, any connection between Porter and Pollock? Well, I don't think they were, friendly in that sense. I mean, Pollock was pretty isolated when he was out, and certainly in more Springs, East Hampton centric. Porter and, as I said, the young painters like Larry Rivers moved out here because of Porter. Certainly that whole sort of a very different sort of social set, I might say. He did not write extensively ever on Porter either, to my knowledge. He was not a huge fan, let's put it that way. So I guess he pretty much kept that to himself. Retrospect. Here comes the question. Yes, about 200. How many Porters in the collection? Any chance of a retrospective? This painting, his paintings just never fail to draw you in and make you think about all those. Not the snapshot, not an exaltation, but sort of something in between those intimate moments. I think the time is ever ripe for that. Is the collection the Freilicher portrait of Kenneth Koch is not in our collection. No, I'm sorry. Did she paint any other New York School poets? She did. She and John Ashbery were very close, and she and Frank O'Hara were very close. So she did, yes, paint both of those. None are in our collection. I think he would have done, this is about self-portraits, so from photos or a mirror, I would say a mirror. That would be my guess. I've never actually read about that. Thank you. Another asking about Porter and Pollock. Yes, I didn't mean to skip that topic, but I don't think there's a whole bunch there. Question from a wonderful painter himself, Tim. Porter's major works are oil on canvas or masonite. What about his watercolors? How significant are they? And do you have any in the Parrish archives? We do have some watercolors, not two. He was a terrific watercolorist. We actually have one very early that he painted at Harvard. It's called The Roofs of Cambridge. So he was much more likely to take a little masonite board, as you mentioned, out outdoors to work. He did not, to my knowledge, do that much with watercolor, but we do have a few. They're wonderful. Why do you think Porter is popular from young painters today? This is from my colleague Corinne at the museum. We hosted an extraordinary group of young painters from graduate students at Columbia who had seen a few Porters and asked if they could come back and see every single one. And nothing makes me happier than showing Porters. Well, this group was amazing, and they sort of hung on every time they were in. Our works are in storage on screens, but very accessible, which is something we really, that was our agreement or promise or pledge, or what we said to Ann Porter, who in some circles people didn't think everything should come to the Parrish. And she said she wanted those works to be kept together, to be a study collection, I mean, to be accessible to scholars at all times. And that's what we have always done. And I will say over the years, it's been my great pleasure. I mean, it was almost like a pilgrimage for many painters, you'd have to say, back in the 70s and 80s, because there was so just not as much figurative painting going on. But I was thrilled by these young students, and excuse me, I thought on another topic I might introduce them to, or just point out the Imagist poets, or William Carlos Williams, or some of the other connections with Porter, who always said, well, Williams said, nothing but in things, you know, nothing, no philosophy. Everything is the object itself. And so I said, there's a very interesting poem by William Carlos Williams called The Red Wheelbarrow. And before I could get out the word, young painter in the front row, she began to recite the poem. And then I said, okay, I can see I don't need to tell you people about Imagist poetry. But I think, you know, I think it's a discovery in a way for possibly younger students who go back and find this frenzy of painting and poetry and writing in that period that's really so unique to American art. And I think that's the interest. And what, as Corinne and I, we were marveling at them, marveling at all the Porters. And what one student said was, when asked what was the attraction of Porter, he just said it's the immediacy of the paint. And that's a word that actually came up in some things I was reading about Ashbery, from Ashbery as well. It is that immediacy. Thanks, Corinne. Sometimes this is another question. Sometimes he started to remove an element from a landscape, but left the removal unfinished. Any ideas why? I happen to like it, by the way. Yeah, I mean, I think some of these, I think any painting that he would have kept, like the question about spring fog, he kept it for a reason. Either he wanted to remember how he got into that and how he maybe didn't get out. Remember, he said when you're looking for order, you fail. When you try to arrange things, you fail. So maybe some of these were failures in the sense of overthinking it, you would almost say. But so I don't know, but that might be why he kept it or wanted to remove it. But I think he kind of, and he would self-censure himself and say, you know, almost maybe I should have gone with the original one. I don't know for sure. It's a great question. Sheila, could you comment on Porter's relationship with Thomas Eakins? I'd like to more. He did write on Eakins. He very much admired him. There's something about this sort of, I don't know, there's a little bit of Maine or down east, or you don't want to say contrariness or orneriness, but I think Porter identified with Eakins, who was almost his whole career in a pitched battle with somebody about something. I don't know, Sheila. I would love to read in on that. Thanks for the question. It's a great one. He did write on Eakins. I'm just not, I couldn't speak directly to the point of the relationship. Thanks. Anonymous. Porter's works are oil and canvas or masonite. What about his watercolors? How significant are they? I don't think it was a significant part of his work, but he did, and we do have a few, but, and they are wonderful. He did them sometimes as studies for paintings. We do have one of a study that was later made into a painting as well. I think anything he's done is significant, certainly in that sense when they're studied for paintings. Thank you. Will you do a talk on April Gornick? That would be wonderful. Maybe we could have a conversation with April. That would be fun too. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. What about Eric and April? I think the fans have spoken. That would be great. I mean, to talk to both of them or talk about their work. Barbara? How many paintings were given? It's over 200. Many, as I say, small. About 30% of those are small works on board, or masonite board, and given by the estate. Yes. Pamela, Larry Rivers' relationship with Fairfield. Well, it was long and enduring. It's one of those anecdotes I didn't go into, although, wow, you could spend hours. Larry Rivers supposedly had proposed to Jane Freilicher, and she rejected him, proposed marriage. And he made an attempt at slitting his wrists, which was not successful, but he did bandage them up. And Frank O'Hara said, look, you need to recuperate. I'm going to take you out to Fairfield Porter's. Now, this is something that Ann Porter always, she used to call it the home for broken down New Yorkers, because both, Fairfield, both generous and long suffering and generous as well. But sure enough, Frank brought Larry Rivers out. Larry Rivers stayed quite a while. He ultimately moved out here quite soon, actually, and raised his 2 boys here with the help of his wonderful mother-in-law. You may remember the lovely Birdie that he painted so often. So Larry was really here very early on, and I will again give a shout out to Mrs. Littlejohn, who purchased an extraordinary Larry Rivers painting in '53. So that was long-standing. Sort of, I don't know, sometimes Fairfield didn't approve of Larry Rivers. This kind of happens off and on. But they remained friends. Any connection between Porter and MoMA, if you didn't address this already? Well, he has several works in the collection. I think, you know, at the time in 1970, he was just not, there's one wonderful sort of tabletop still life of his. I mean, he was undeniably a great painter, but certainly no one that Porter pursued in great, that MoMA pursued in great depth. Did he know Alice Neal? You know, I don't know. I haven't heard that. I'm sure he did, though. He probably wrote about her work. Who did he study painting with? Did he study painting at college or after? He was at the Art Students League. He was, you know, sort of in the period with Thomas Hart Benton was, you know, everybody sort of had Benton at some point. Aside from that, he studied with a Dutch painter in New York who was teaching. He sort of had a, you know, episodic career. He wasn't a, you know, sort of known student of a well-known artist in that sense. I don't believe. Let's see. Here's someone who knew the family growing up, who actually Ann Porter offered the studio to him to work in. That's wonderful. Oh, hello. Someone told me I could close now. Thank you. It's like, say goodnight, Gracie. I think yes, this is it. All right, friends. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. Another wonderful program next week. Stay tuned. Watch your inbox. You'll have an announcement. Bye.